Welcome to this episode of Fossils and Fiction, a podcast that explores the stories of prehistoric life, most often through the stories we humans tell about it. It's produced by me, Travis Holland, with support from Charles Sturt University. Enjoy.
He had a temporary workshop which was full of half-built models. There is a photograph available of the studio. Some were nearly finished, some were half finished. What happened on May the 3rd in 1871 was a gang of organised thugs with sledgehammers went in and completely smashed up everything into very small pieces, carted the pieces away and buried them somewhere in Central Park.
On this episode of Fossils and Fiction, the mystery of who destroyed Central Park's dinosaurs. My guest is Vicky Coules, a PhD candidate and researcher at the University of Bristol in the UK. Vicky is looking into the entanglements between visual culture and dinosaurs, and that took her into the story of the 1871 attack on a nascent Palaeozoic museum destined for New York's Central Park. Vicky and Michael Benton recently published a paper on that topic, and we chat about that and more. Vicky, I have this wonderful paper in my hands called The Curious Case of Central Park's Dinosaurs, which you've just published alongside Michael Benton. Could you tell me about these dinosaurs?
Right. Well, the dinosaurs in the paper never actually came into existence. If I can just do a little bit of a backstory there.
Yeah.
The main character in the story, Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, was British. He was an artist and sculptor, and he became well known because in the early 1850s, he was responsible for designing and creating the models, the life-size models that were placed in the Crystal Palace in London, the Crystal Palace Park in London. And this was as a result of the Great Exhibition, and I think that's 1853, but they moved the whole thing to a park because it was so successful, and they built additional attractions, one of which they called the Geological Court, which the idea was to show the progression of geology. Hawkins was brought in to model and build the life-size models of the creatures that were known at the time. They're referred to as the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, although some of them are not actually dinosaurs, as we would call them that. But that's how they're referred to. Now, in 1860s, he went to America, and he was well known by then. So he was asked by the Central Park Committee, Central Park was developing then. I mean, New York was expanding after the Civil War. They wanted a park in the center of the city. They wanted more than just green space. So he was commissioned. He was known for the Crystal Palace dinosaurs. He was commissioned to design and build something similar for Central Park using American prehistoric creatures, not the European ones.
Naturally.
And the difference, the difference would be that these would be indoors. They would presumed to avoid the extremes of the New York weather, but he was going to design and build these life-size models again, and they would be put inside a purpose-built museum. So that's what he was doing. He, in the course of this, he had to research the different dinosaurs, so he got invited to go around to the different existing museums that had fossils. One of them was in Philadelphia, the Academy of Natural Sciences, and they had just been working on the first nearest complete dinosaur fossil they'd found, which was the Hadrosaurus falkii. Mm-hmm. And it was Hawkins' idea, while he was looking at this fossil, that he could actually, with the help of some plaster cast models, he could actually build and mount a full-size skeleton. Which had never, ever been done before anywhere, surprisingly, not in Europe, not in the UK. And which he did, and this was went down an absolute storm. They put it on display in the museum. It was posed in a bipedal position. It was big, and the public loved it. So this gave more impetus for the Central Park project. He went back to New York and was working on the Central Park project. So the dinosaurs that he was designing, actually, he only had two. One was the Hadrosaurus, as I mentioned. The other was Laelaps, and I've forgotten the second name. I can look that up. Which was a smaller predatory dinosaur, but that's all they had in terms of dinosaurs in America at the time. But he also was going to put in mammoths and glyptodonts and other prehistoric creatures, and that was all going well. And that's the basis. So he was part of the way through this project. He was building the models, the armatures, and so on when it all went wrong. So that was the sort of background to what happened. If I explain what I'm doing to have got involved in this, I'm doing a PhD at Bristol part-time, and what I'm looking at is dinosaurs in visual culture, because everybody loves dinosaurs, children, adults, the media, and so on. And nobody has really looked at them in the context of visual culture itself. So I am registered in Bristol's History of Art department in the Faculty of the Arts, but I'm co-supervised by Professor Mike Benton, who was my co-author on the paper, who is the head of they call it the Paleobiology Research Group. So it's Bristol's Department of Paleontology, and it's quite a big, thriving department. It does a lot of new paleobiology and so on. And so I'm across two departments, really. And one of the things I was interested in is in how these images of dinosaurs, which almost began to appear as soon as dinosaurs were discovered, how they were affected by and affected things like the relationship with the science itself. It's interesting that paleontology, as you know, is one of the few sciences that really depends on artists to actually visualize what it is they're working on. So there's been this relationship between art and science forever. So that's what I'm doing. My actual research focuses on the middle to end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century in America. And that's because that's where what we often call dinomania took off. What happened was the actual public enthusiasm and craze for dinosaurs kicked off in America. And it was partly as a result of the Hadrosaurus I've mentioned earlier. And that's where it really took off, this enthusiasm for dinosaurs. So that's why I'm concentrating on that period and that area, and in the course of which I'm doing 4 case studies. The first case study is Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins in America, and initially I was interested in the build of the Hadrosaurus and the effect it had on everything from visitor numbers to the media interest. I knew about the Central Park case, and it was in the process of researching all this for my first case study, for my first chapter in the dissertation, that I began to question the case and eventually came up with the research that formed the basis of the paper.
Yeah. Well, we might jump back to that one now. So what actually happened? He was in the process of working on these dinosaurs, and suddenly they were destroyed somewhat mysteriously.
Well, what had happened is, if we can sort of step outside that slightly, New York was going through a bit of political turmoil, and the Democrats were in power and expanding their power. There was a politician named William Tweed. His nickname was Boss. That's how he referred to himself, who had a small cohort around him. And to all intents and purposes, he was essentially corrupt. He was trying to get power. He was getting contracts. I mean, you can imagine New York in that period, in the late 1860s, early 1870s. There was a lot of building going on, expansion going on. And he was giving contracts to his mates. He was moving money around in ways that perhaps were raised as eyebrows. He was doing things like giving jobs. There was a huge influx of Irish immigrants to New York, who some of them, of course, were fleeing from the potato famine or had done. But he was becoming known as somebody who was trying to find absolute power, and also there were people who were beginning to be suspicious that he was not doing it in the most way with the most integrity. Now he then decided to put his own people in charge of the board of commissioners that looked after Central Park. They expanded it to include all the public parts. So there was a change of if you like, management at the top of the people in Central Park who had commissioned a museum. And almost the first thing they did was cancel the project. That in itself isn't terribly controversial, because looking at the figures, and I've been able to look at some of the finances, this was being funded out of city funds, and it was expensive. It was going to be a purpose building. It was going to have, a fairly well-established area within the park. The models themselves and so on were costing money. Hawkins was being paid. And they decided that the cost of completion was too much, and so they cancelled the project. And that in itself happens, and it happens a lot of times.
That's politics.
That's politics, that's finance, that's economics. What was shocking and what was surprising, Hawkins went back to the board and tried to persuade them to not cancel, that it had a value in education and science and so on, but they were having none of it. But it would have lied there, except for the fact, so this cancellation happened at the end of 1870. What happened in May 1871 was the workshop, he had a temporary workshop, which was full of half-built models. There is a photograph available of the studio. Some were nearly finished, some were half finished. What happened on May the 3rd in 1871 was a gang of organised thugs with sledgehammers went in and completely smashed up everything into very small pieces, carted the pieces away and buried them somewhere in Central Park. And that was the incident that caused the sort of shockwaves everywhere. So that was what had actually happened.
And it was initially attributed to Boss Tweed, right?
Oh. So the question became, as historians of paleontology said, well, why? Who sent these in? Because this wasn't just a sort of mindless, gang of oiks were looking for something to do. This was organised and sent in and so on. Everybody then attributed this to Boss Tweed, and they attributed it to him for different reasons. One of the reasons they said it was him was one of the things that got me suspicious that maybe it wasn't. So I can, if you like, I can go into why I didn't believe this, if you see what I mean, and why I.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely interested. And what really interests me about the whole story really is this is one of the very earliest moments, I think, at which politics and culture are really tied up with dinosaurs, and we see that again and again later on as they kind of become more and more a part of the cultural imagination. I think this is a really fascinating story that goes right back to those roots.
Well, this is what interests me anyway in my whole project. And I mean, even you could argue, stepping outside slightly, that the whole of history of art is, if any item or object or artifact of art you have, you can't examine it or identify it in isolation from the surrounding culture, politics, and so on. It takes a huge chunk of the actual work that goes in a history of art project, is to take that and look at what had affected the artist. But in this case, you're absolutely right. This relationship between politics, actually the relationship is between politics, between culture, between science, and basically economics. And it's a really tangled relationship, but you're absolutely right that this is an indication of what happened. My suspicions, reading the accounts that were in the, if you like, either papers or, as you know, you get either textbooks, not many textbooks of the history of paleontology, but there's usually something in paleontology textbooks. And the consensus story seemed to be that Tweed had done this, he had ordered it, and the reason a lot of people quoted that he'd ordered it were that in March 1871, so the project had been cancelled and Hawkins still wasn't very happy and he'd lost a lot of income and so on. There was a meeting of the New York Lyceum of Natural History, which is one of these learned societies that they get together and read science papers and so on. But he was a member of that. He went to the meeting and this subject came up about the cancellation, and the scientists at the meeting it was minuted as not being, very impressed and thought it shouldn't have been cancelled. And somebody made a slightly sarcastic comment about, well, if it isn't going to make Tweed money, then it's not going to, happen. But that was almost a throwaway line. And officially within the meeting, somebody else said, well, look, that's not a helpful comment. Let's look at what happened. And that was it. And that was reported in the New York Times. And the argument went that Tweed was so enraged by being criticised in the New York Times that he ordered this as an act of revenge. And that's the main real reason that people gave. The other reason was that, it was blasphemous because there was the whole issue around Darwin and evolution. That was another reason that was given. And in the paperwork, if you like, the reports, they use the term pre-Adamite. And as Mike Benton has pointed out several times, it didn't mean that it was blasphemous. It was the same way that we would today use the term prehistoric. It was just one of the ways of referring to it then. So I was reading these accounts.
Sorry, I was going to say, and potentially that interpretation of pre-Adamite as being sort of blasphemous as a term rather than a descriptive term. The people who've made that interpretation, perhaps they're bringing their own politics to it as well, yes. Which is interesting.
And the consensus was, if they used the term pre-Adamite, then they meant it was, blasphemous and so on. And there was a tendency, which I'll come back to in a minute, to assume that in the end of the 19th century, there was this very simple religion versus science dispute. And so everybody put together the thinking and said that Tweed was enraged by the newspaper report of this meeting, which happened in March, and was possibly, some writers have said, they thought it was blasphemous or whatever, or he wasn't going to get enough money out of it. Anyway, reading all this, first of all, I thought that doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was that this newspaper report of this meeting in the New York Times, which, thanks to the wonders of digital technology and so on, you can access all this online. I found this report and it's buried on page 5 of the New York Times, just a few column inches, and it's reporting on a standard meeting of a learned society. And they would have done that over here if there'd been a meeting of the Royal Society or whatever. You see what I mean? They would have just reported on that meeting. And it was innocuous. It was on page 5. And it was
part
published
of the happenings of the city.
Well, it was just part of this in the middle of page 5, buried in a load of other text. The newspapers then were not quite as shall we say, visual as they are today, as you know. Anyway, that report came out on March the 3rd. So my first question was, well, if that came out on March the 3rd, why wait 2 months if it was an act of vengeance? If he'd seen this report and was furious, why wait 2 months? Why not do it within a few days? And my other question was more to do with, again, the history of New York. Was Tweed was in power, but there were an awful lot of people who were very suspicious and indignant about who he was. And by then, he was fighting for his political life. And Thomas Nast, the famous cartoonist, was beginning to bring out the vicious cartoons of Tweed and what they called the Tweed Ring, his mates, and the corruption. They accused him of vote rigging. They accused him of money laundering and goodness knows what else. So my other question was, you can even look through the New York Times, and only 2 days after the report of the meeting, so I think it's around March the 10th or something earlier than that, the headline on the front page of the New York Times is something derogatory about Tweed. So my other question is if he's fighting for his political life and being challenged publicly by Harper's Weekly and New York Times and so on, why was he wasting time getting so upset about this effectively cancellation of a minor project? So those two questions immediately made me think something doesn't look right here. And I started to go into it. And that's how I started going back and trying to get into the primary sources to find out what had actually happened. So that was the starting point. I was talking this over with Mike, who as a professor of paleontology, he is actually very interested in the history of the subject and knowledgeable. So he was interested in what I was doing anyway. So we would be discussing this at regular intervals. But that was what, for me, triggered the questions that made me go back and look at it again.
And in part of looking at it again, what was the story that you uncovered? Not to give away the ending as such, but I guess that's where we're at, isn't it?
Well, it wasn't Tweed. That's what I found, and what I was able to do. And I would say, I would like to make it really clear that the reason I could do this and unpick all this now was because the good people of New York City and the Library of Congress and so on have put all the records online. And that's
very helpful for researchers.
Exactly. So I was able to sit, at home in Bristol with my feet up and a glass of wine and read the annual reports of the Board of Commissioners of Central Park, the minutes of all the meetings, the access to the newspapers. I could get into the New York Times archives. I could get into the other archives. I could see, all that was available now. And to be fair, when other people were writing these accounts, I suspect to have gone into this level of research, somebody would have had to have physically gone into a basement somewhere in New York City and found stuff. You see what I mean? It would have been much more practically difficult. So I would say that the timing is simply because all this stuff is online. When I started my PhD, which was a while ago, it seemed like a brilliant idea, and it would seem very practical for various reasons, that it was quite feasible for me to go to America and go to archives, go to museums, meet researchers and so on. So at the time, it was one of those great ideas at the time. But of course, then when COVID hit, that all went out the window. I would also say that since then, I have been absolutely thrilled at how much help I've had from people in America. People, whether it's academics or archives, or there's been that sense of people genuinely wanting to help and sending me material or pointing material out to me or whatever, which has been great. So that's been helpful.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic when you're doing research and there are people willing to help, through no benefit to themselves as such, except helping to unearth, a story that is worth being told somewhere. So I'm really interested in, we can keep talking about the paper. That's there's plenty there as well, but I'll certainly point people to it and encourage it. It's a really interesting read. But I'm really interested in the rest of your PhD as well. Could I get a little insight into some of the other projects that you're also looking at there?
Yes, I'm looking at, as I said, 4 case studies. Excuse me. The first is the one I mentioned. So it was what happened in America to trigger this enthusiasm that still exists today. And that is essentially the mounting of the hadrosaur. We look at that in the paper in more detail, how we went about it and so on. And just the whole approach to the fact that they'd found dinosaurs, these creatures that were so different from anything else and so on. That's my first one. So I break it into 4. The second one is the painter Charles Knight, who is probably still one of the best known paleo artists, if you like.
Yeah.
He worked at the American Museum of Natural History most of the time, not all of the time, and he was painting dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures. He was using colour and he was putting them into, if you like, what I call a cinematic landscape. So his images were full colour, full landscape images, paintings, and he really pioneered that way of representing creatures. I'm specifically looking at dinosaurs, but he is one of the best known. But I wanted to go back and look at him again as an artist. And what's interesting about him is he was trained formally as an artist. He went to art school. He was taught traditional methods of painting and some sculpture. And so I look at him again, and a bit like you mentioned earlier, I look at things like the relationship between his work, the museum. So this is also a sort of museum-based chapter, and how museum displays were decided on, how they were reaction of the public, and the relationship with the science as well, how he related to the scientists in the museum, how he worked with them, and so on. So that's my second one. I then look at how it moved into entertainment, and I look at the third case, which is Gertie the dinosaur, which is the 1914 animation by Winsor McCay. And he initially did this whole cartoon as entertainment, as for his vaudeville act. He was a vaudeville performer on stage, would project the cartoon onto a screen and interact with it. So we've moved away from them being used in museum displays to, if you like, educate, into entertainment. So that's my third one.
And suddenly that's the jump into pop culture, which is...
And it comes into pop culture. And then what's interesting is they have come into pop culture. They were beginning to come in, but Gertie was a huge achievement, and I also look at the animation that was used. And my fourth case is Walt Disney's Fantasia, which has got the sequence of the Rite of Spring. In the dinosaurs feature very heavily in that. But what's interesting when I started looking into this is between Gertie, which was 1914, and Fantasia, which came out in 1940, there is effectively no drawn animation of dinosaurs.
Really?
There's
That is a
stop frame.
surprise.
Yes, there's stop frame, of course. You have Willis O'Brien, you have The Lost World, you have King Kong, and so on. So they were getting some interest, but I've looked into this a lot. And in terms of Gertie, which is a line drawn animation, to Fantasia, which was, as you know, full colour for the big screen. So those two almost bookend that period. And so those are the four case studies I look at. And the second two, as you can see, are into entertainment. But what's interesting is even with Gertie and with Walt Disney and Fantasia, they are very keen to get the science right.
Yes, I actually rewatched Fantasia just last week, and you know the narrator or the introducer at the start of it says that this is all based on the science. He claims he says that very forwardly, we're trying to get this right based on the scientific fact, which is really a fascinating approach.
So in that case, I look into who the scientists were that he were dealt with, how the animators got their information. At what point did the studio decide to deviate from the science? Because the dinosaur enthusiasts will immediately point out that there's no way T-Rex would have fought a Stegosaurus, for example. And also there's the fascinating, to me, case of they gave T-Rex 3 fingers rather than 2. And that's why I look into that whole area. But also, going back to Gertie, Winsor McCay lived in New York, and he was very familiar with the AMNH. He was in and out, and he based Gertie on the Brontosaurus model, as it was then, that was mounted, and initially the first display was in about 1905. And he was really trying to make his dinosaur based on the Brontosaurus. So he wasn't just making something up. He was also very keen that it was right, if you like. And I have seen accounts. I haven't verified them, but I've seen accounts. That he would actually go in and be an absolute pain talking to the staff, wanting to know how it would move, how it would, balance and so on. Now I have a theory, and I can't prove it, but I'm going to say it anyway. I would like to think that Winsor McKay met Charles Knight. If you look at the dates, that the dates that McKay was going into the museum, getting all his references for Gertie, Knight was painting, and I just think it would be poetic if they'd actually met each other. I mean, I don't have any diary entries or anything, but I just look at the dates and think that might have been the case. But anyway, those are my 4 studies, and between the 4 of them, they really take us from attempting to show something in a museum right the way through to the big screen with Fantasia.
What are you finding so far? What ties the 4 case studies together? Is there anything that you can say, even at this stage, that you say across these 4 case studies, this is something that brings them all together, or is a finding that I can point to as something that holds the relationship between dinosaurs and visual culture in that period together?
I think there are 2 things. I think in each case there was this relationship with the science. There was the idea that if we're going to show dinosaurs visually, you have to be able to show them with as much of the information available at the time. They weren't trying to go off and just make up a creature. They were all the artists, as I would call them, and even if you look at the intermediate things, the stop frames, which I don't go into in detail, but I have to look at as a sort of comparison, they are trying very hard, and that is something that I think whether it's a museum display right the way through to its entertainment. I mean, we could even say today with Jurassic Park and the spin-offs and so on, there was a modicum of intent to make it look as scientifically realistic as possible. That was one thing. That it does seem to be consistent. So it looks as if the second 2 cases are, they're entertainment, to make money. But there was still this insistence on getting the science right. And the other thing is how much the images, particularly from Knight onwards, are affected by contemporary culture around it. So if we look at Charles Knight, for example, I'm looking at the idea. His paintings, his dinosaurs are quite macho. They're tie-in, and what was happening at the time was you were getting things like big game hunting, Roosevelt, and so on. What I'm looking at is how the surrounding cultural activities feed back into how the dinosaurs are represented. I find it fascinating with Gertie that he makes her female, and there are all sorts of interesting reasons as to why Gertie is a female. But also, when I looked at Gertie, I mean, I'm happy to talk about what I found. What surprised me was the other huge entertainment, particularly for the working classes at the time, was the circus. And I started to look at Gertie, and I looked at the circus, and what I found was that the structure of Gertie the dinosaur, the cartoon, is the same as the structure of the big cat acts in a circus. So the progression of events through the act, he's obviously based that on having seen these in the circus, and he even dresses like a circus ringmaster in his act. So there's this whole the surrounding culture is feeding back in. And the thing I found about Fantasia, which I've written about in a sort of relatively informal way for my dissertation, tried it out on people, if you like, tried out the ideas on historians as well as art, history of art. And I have a good relationship. Bristol has a department of film and television, and one of the senior lecturers there is an expert in the history of animation, so I've talked to him at length. But in the Fantasia film, they show the dinosaurs as going extinct in the desert.
Yes.
And they
It.
had no real reason to know that. And happily, my supervisor, Mike Benton, one of his areas of expertise are the theories of extinction historically. And he said, no, they were ideas floating around, all sorts of ideas as to why they went extinct, but they didn't know. But then, if you, as you've already pointed out at the beginning of that sequence, the introduction gives it away, because what was happening in California when that film was being animated was the fallout from the Dust Bowl.
Mhm.
And that Dust Bowl incident in America, I'm sure people will be familiar with it. It was the main mid plains, the farming techniques and so on had stripped the surface of support, so there was a drought, the wind was blowing the surface away, all the crops failed. It was a huge, huge environmental disaster. And the workers, the farmers and so on, were having to leave, and an awful lot of them ended up in California. And so there's a huge cultural, political, economic issue going on at the time in California when the animation was being made. And if you look at the beginning of that sequence, he actually uses that phrase. He says they disappeared, they walked out, they trekked he uses the phrase the gigantic dust bowl. And so my thinking there is that would have been such a huge issue in California, in Los Angeles at the time, in the late 1930s. So it
That's
affected
essentially the environment that Disney
yes,
itself was sort of coming up in.
exactly,
Yeah, absolutely.
exactly. And so
And I
that was
think,
the
yeah, we really see this right through the history of dinosaurs, don't we? We
yes,
see that they're repeatedly used, particularly in relation to the environment, to both used as allegories for, I guess, human relationships with the environment. So there's that circumstance, and we talk about, people as dinosaurs as well.
yes,
People who have old fashioned thinking, for example, and should go extinct, or those kinds of things like that. There's very common cultural currency to use dinosaurs in a way to tell these other stories of environmental messages, quite often. And even nowadays, there's conversations about what can dinosaurs tell us about climate change and adapting to
mm,
changing environments all around the planet. And even paleontologists are telling these stories, that one of the reasons paleontology is important is because it tells us how animals adapt to a changing environment, which is where we find ourselves right now.
exactly. And I think that's it is. I mean, I know in Bristol they do a lot of work on that. How also, as you say, how did animals adapt to quite extreme changes in environment, and then what went wrong? What happened where they couldn't adapt?
Hmm.
So there's that whole information. And I think, as you say, that sort of cultural currency. I mean, one of the things I look at earlier on, more to do with around the Charles Knight era. So you're looking at late 1890s to early 20th century. There was this sense of dinosaurs being dragged in as icons of things like the corporate expansion in America,
Hmm.
the huge fortunes that were being made, the difference between the small business community and then the huge corporations. They were coming into the argument about what was viable and what went extinct and so on. And there's a sense of what was interesting as well is that chasing the money is interesting. So even the economics come into it. There's a
Yeah.
brilliant book by Lucas Rappel, who wrote a book called Assembling the Dinosaur, and he looks at the economics, if you like, and politics of all this. And the early museums, the American Museum, the um, Pittsburgh, museum in Pittsburgh, and so on, all these museums were funded by these huge, well, they called them the robber barons, didn't they, in an
Hmm.
unflattering way? But they
Yeah.
were all funded by philanthropy, by people
Yeah.
saying, oh, well, we
Carnegie
better
and the like.
yeah, Carnegie, JP Morgan, and so
Hmm.
on. We'd better educate the masses. And so, but they were funding the museums, they were funding the digs. JP Morgan was effectively funding Charles Knight's employment. So there's this huge cultural, political tangle that. So just drawing a picture of a dinosaur doesn't really just stand out on its own. It's all immersed in various cultural issues.
Yeah. And I certainly think we see that now, even if there's a proposal for a new museum or moving a museum or whatever it is, because that's kind of coming out of the public dollar, it becomes immediately a politicized
Mm.
issue, and questioning what is the value of these, whatever it happens to be.
Yes, and also the
Absolutely.
other side of it is that people use the argument, well, if you put a dinosaur in a museum, you'll get visitors.
Hmm.
Um, and so there is the simple economics of, if you want a museum, natural history museum, to do well, then put a dinosaur in it and people will come. I have some figures somewhere. We've had our Diplodocus in the UK, kind gift from Mr. Carnegie, that's been moved around because of changes in the Natural History Museum, and it went for a while to a museum in the Midlands, and the phenomenal increase in visitor numbers to that museum, made a huge economic change. So the other argument with museums is, if we put a dinosaur in, then if they will come, the visitors will come.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you've got that side of it as well. People go to a museum now and expect to see one, um, which is
And
part of
not
the.
just any dinosaur. If you can get a T-Rex, all
Oh
the
yeah,
better. There's a lot of museums. I think
absolutely.
that's why, Stan was sold to a new museum being set up in the Middle East, because, well, if you want a dinosaur, Stan's the one to get, isn't it? Stan the T-Rex. So, uh, absolutely. Uh, Vicky, is there anything else you wanted to cover? There's so much there, and I'm sure I'd love to have you back and talk some more. But I really thank you so much for having a chat, letting me talk and ask you questions about the PhD. They're always impolite to ask a PhD student how they're progressing, but thank you
Well,
so
I
much.
didn't cry. So, the trouble is here. If you do it part time, a normal PhD is probably much the same there, as you have 3 years plus a year to effectively
Yeah,
write up. But here,
basically.
I've got 8 years, so it's like I've been doing this forever. I'm now in sort of coming through year 6, and I have other things I've been doing. So, but it's been interesting, and if I the Paleomedia project that I set up, the reason I set that up was, like yourself, people were so interested in what I was doing. Um, I started a discussion group in Bristol, just amongst, we run an MSc course on paleobiology, for example. So I just set it up to look at anything to do with dinosaurs or equivalent,
Mhm.
which got a lot of interest. So it wasn't necessarily as focused as my PhD is. And then, of course, COVID hit. But I took it online. And when I took it online, I then actually got more people interested, because they could come in from anywhere and we would
Yeah.
have online sessions. They haven't gone away. It's just that situations changed for a bit. I've now got somebody helping me with the project. So we do plan to go back, and put things online. But the last one of the earlier online sessions I did, about Fantasia, I had somebody come in from Chicago. I think she'd got up at some Gothisec hour in the morning to come in. And that's simply why I set up the blog, the Facebook group, and so on, just because people seemed so interested in this, that it was a way of bringing people together, really, and taking it wider than my academic research. My supervisor keeps saying to me, "You have to focus. Stop bouncing off and getting interested in something else." But this allows me to do that.
As a supervisor myself, I can attest to that as good advice,
Yeah.
but also advice that as a student I didn't take. So,
Yeah. So that's. But yeah. So I mean, anybody who's interested in it is welcome to join. The email list, the group.
for sure,
It's, and I've sort of, there's been dragons and all sorts of things have come into it, so it's fairly relaxed, shall we say.
I'll put some links to both the article and also to the Paleo Media Group in the show notes. Vicky, thank you so much again.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks again to Vicky for telling us all about the fascinating story of the Central Park dinosaurs and also her broader PhD research. There are links to the article and also the Bristol Paleo Media project in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fossils and Fiction. We're always looking for more paleo stories to tell and welcome your suggestions through our social channels. You can also send voice notes via Spotify or social media. Podcast theme music is Sonora by Quincas Morea via the YouTube audio library. Show notes are available on the website, fossilsfiction.co. Please subscribe and rate the podcast on your preferred podcasting platform.